Good evening, everybody, and you're all very welcome to our first IStructE evening lecture of the 2018-29 season. And thanks for making a big effort to come in after work. It's always a big effort to come across the traffic in Dublin. But I think tonight would be well worth. You'll be happy you came in the end, I think, because we have a very renowned bridge engineer with us tonight, Bill Harvey. Many of you know Bill through your working lives. For those who don't know Bill, he's a bridge engineer with maybe 50 years experience, both as a practitioner and as an academic, with a special interest in masonry structures. And his special software that he wrote himself, RGM, is the go-to software in the field. And he's constantly innovating, and tonight he'll probably tell us a bit more about photogrammetry and other developments in the field of data capture and bridge modelling. But without further ado, I'll just welcome you, Bill, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
How on earth a man of 35 can have 50 years experience, I don't know. Maybe I can't count. At one stage this talk was advertised as something completely different. Let's see where we go. I want to talk a bit about viaducts and about what happens when you realise that you've got your engineering wrong and you need to backpedal. And it's quite interesting when you get your engineering wrong and there are literally hundreds of people just following along behind you using the same thing. It's quite a challenge. I'll talk a little bit about me. I'll talk a bit about ideas and thinking about mapping the problem from one place to another, which is rarely a good idea, about looking at stuff and observing stuff and actually allowing yourself to see things, and about some fresh ideas. But first a bit about me. Back in 1954, when I was 7, there we are, there's the final thing about how old I am. An uncle took me to visit Clifton, and from then on I was a bridge engineer. Whatever else happened, I was going to be a bridge engineer. And I always imagined building big bridges. And now I'm working in Clifton, and will this work? Actually, I don't think I need to do that. I think it's already loaded. I'm working in the bowels of Clifton Suspension Bridge, in these spaces which are called the vaults underneath. This is a 3D model, and if I turn to there and move it up a bit and zoom in a bit, you can see from the size of that ladder how big that hole is that I have to crawl through to get in there. And when I was there 6 years ago, I said, if you do this every 6 years, I might not be able to do it next time. But I was in this summer. But I really suspect that next time it might be just too hard. But it makes for very interesting work, and the 3D modelling makes interesting stuff. This space is pitch black. There is no light in there whatsoever. So these photographs are taken with flash, with a camera on a pole, and well, we'll talk a bit more about that later if we get a chance. But there's a little bit more about it here. If we look at the top of the thing, you can see these stalactites, which are the size of drinking straws, and they're like drinking straws, they're hollow. So if you do that, they break off and fall. And some of those were 10 metres long when they opened the vaults for the first time in 100 years or so. The section, if we look a little closer, tells us quite a lot about the construction up here. What I noticed when I looked at it was that all these joints are empty, up to about this level. Maybe if I come over here and point, it's easier, isn't it? Up to about this level, all the joints are tight. From here, they're all empty. And the stones don't look true. And when you take a section like this, you can see how each stone has actually done that. And they've been building freehand, but the stones have been floating on the water and rolling back into place. And that sort of thing, you only get to find out by using modern technology and studying it. And I don't think you would see it from a point cloud. So 73, 26, I'd done my PhD, and I had a 2 years apprenticeship with Leeds City Council, and then got a job on the Humber Bridge. So the bridge engineer has arrived, building the biggest bridge in the world, and after 18 months I was bored out of my skull. I was working for Freeman Fox as a supervising engineer, and the work was important, but there was nothing you could do about the fact that people were doing things wrong and slowly, and so frustrating. And they were building this bridge just down the road, which actually, to a large extent, made Humber Bridge redundant. And somebody had whispered that they were looking for a section engineer, so I rang up and made the switch to contracting and found myself building bridges on the Ouse in '75. From there I was working on the concrete deck, which was where I'd been up to then. I moved to Redpath, Dorman Long, and they said, you need to learn about steel bridges. We're building a bridge in Dunkeld. Away you go. 6 months in Dunkeld, working with 3.5 metre deep steel girders, launching 800 tonnes of girder across the river. And these sorts of things give you a completely different feel for engineering. You pick up 800 tonnes and slide it across the river, and you lose all fear of weights and stuff like that. It's just engineering, just do it. There's no difference between that and picking up a bar of soap and squeezing it across the room. Just do the sums, it's okay. And from there I got back to Humber Bridge and was working on the cables just for 6 months, because by that time I'd already been given a job at Dundee University, lecturing, which was good fun. This was fairly lively. And I found myself casting around for something to do research on, and a colleague said, why not arch bridges? Because nobody's done any arch bridges forever. And I was just getting engaged with that, and the Transport Lab asked us whether we would be interested in doing monitoring on this bridge, because it was just at that point coming up to 250 years old. And up on the hill behind, they were opening a varieties mine, and they knew it was going to be taking a lot of heavy loads. They had no idea how heavy. The people who were hauling the varieties were using grain trucks, and they were filling it. Now, grain trucks have sides this high. Varieties this deep is a full load. They were putting 100 tonnes of varieties in the bin on a 40-tonne wagon. So 100 tonnes of varieties plus the weight of the wagon on 5 axles bouncing over this bridge every 10 minutes. And bouncing was the word, because I was hanging underneath there in that frame, and you could feel the bridge do this as the trucks went over. But I hated not building bridges, and the golf club in Aberfeldy asked us if we could build a bridge across the River Tay, and in 1992 we built what is still the longest plastic bridge in the world. And we're quite proud of that. It's been closed for a little while, but it's now open again. But my life these days is all about masonry bridges, and masonry bridges are absolutely fascinating. So, what's the purpose of talking now? I listen very often to podcasts by Brian Cox and Robin Ince called The Infinite Monkey Cage. If you've never listened to it, have a go. It's really good fun. A comedian and a serious physicist and guests talking about science. And one of the things that Brian Cox says over and over again is that all models are wrong, but some are useful. It depends how wrong they are. But in science, everything is just the best idea we have now. It isn't right, it's the best idea we have now. Engineers have real trouble with that, because they know that people's lives depend on it. So that's quoted quite often by Brian Cox. It came from the 1976 books on statistics. And one thing that the guy said was, remember that all models are wrong. The practical question is, how wrong do they have to be not to be useful? And the answer is, not as wrong as some of ours. Some of ours are really seriously misleading, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. The code to practice for masonry bridges, the one for Network Rail, the one for the Highways Agency in the UK, and both of those are used in Ireland, are not capable of telling us anything useful about the bridges, because the models are wrong. A couple of years ago, actually it's 4 years ago now, I realised that I'd been really wrong about viaducts, and it's taken a while to get the idea sorted out. I published a paper in the Civils a year ago. There are more papers needed yet. we model arches and piers. And that's partly because we call them arch bridges. And what I'm going to show you is that calling them arch bridges is wishful thinking. But they are much more complex than that anyway. You cannot separate any part of the structure which has any sort of stiffness, because it will take part in carrying the load if you push any load in that direction. And if you have bits that are stiffer than the arch, then the stiff bits are going to carry the load. And calling them arch bridges stops your thinking, which is why it took me so long to work it out. So if we start with what Hooke said, which was that, when was this, 1675? As hangs the flexible line, so but inverted stands the rigid arch. Of course, you can't turn a flexible line upside down. If you're going to make the arch stand up, you have to give it a little bit of stability. But nevertheless, I think you can see that that's basically the same shape. And you can also see that the line that I've chosen for the arch isn't in any way connected with the basic shape of the structure. Now that model is a replica of something that was used by William Barlow to the civils in 1846 in a paper saying that we can never know where the thrust goes in an arch, but we can understand enough to be confident it's going to work. And every time I refer to that 1846 paper, somebody comes back and says, 1846? I said, yes, he was right in 1846. We don't need to look any more recently than that, and it's worth reading. So, that led me to a model of viaducts. So let's just fill in a little bit. On that bridge in Aberfeldy, we had an assessment which was clearly wrong. About that time, Hayman was doing all his work on the thrust line analysis of arches, and he was then, he's a very old man now, he was then an old man now. He was younger than I am, but to me he seemed a very old man. And he wasn't into computers, and I was kind of into computers, and I set to writing a little computer program to do what he'd done. And then somebody said, I want to buy that, and suddenly I found myself in business selling computer software. Wasn't part of the plan, but another little note to the younger members of the crew, there is no plan. Just take whatever opportunities the world gives you, because there is no plan. Don't map a career and try to, because that may heads failure. Just look at the next good thing that comes in front of you and take it and make something of it. So, people started to say, what about viaducts? Oh, viaducts. What are we going to do with viaducts? And I thought, well, actually, they're going to work like active and... Whoops, sorry. If you push down on one arch, which we might like to talk about as active, as in soil mechanics, then the other arch resists. And as the other arch lifts, the thrust is forced downwards at the crown and upwards at the springing, so it's a flatter curve, pushes harder. So it resists. Which is magical, because what it tells you is that you can't do any harm to a viaduct, because no matter how hard you push here, this is going to push back harder. Great. Good news. And the good news is reinforced when you see somebody doing something really silly. Now, I've shown this to 5-year-olds, and I can already see people sort of starting to go, and yet an engineer approved this demolition process. This is the single-track railway that used to carry Queen Victoria to Balmoral from Aberdeen, and it was no longer needed, and Network Rail, well, British Rail in those days, were not prepared to pay the cost of maintaining it, so they said they'd take it down, and Mr. McIntosh, the contractor, said, well, the span over the road is the difficult one. We'll timber out the road on the first Sunday and we'll take that span down, and then we can use the rest of the 3-month contract to take the rest down. Did he know what he was doing? Well, he's got a very quiet smile on his face, whereas the engineer with the clipboard is beginning to look a little uncomfortable. But notice there's barely a metre of bridge left at this point, and then away it goes, and away goes the rest of it. But you look at that and you say it only needed a metre width of bridge to prop up the rest, and you think, yeah, okay, this propping action works. So I'm feeling kind of comfortable, and I'm starting to think, well, actually the spandrel walls are even stiffer, so they provide even more resistance to it falling over. And there's another layer which I'm going to come to in a minute. But let's just first of all look at London Road Viaduct in Brighton, which in 1941 suffered a misfortune. A bomb took one pier out, and the two spans either side stayed there. Two spans went because there was no support at all, but the two spans either side stayed there. What? Well, they were held up by those railway lines. Not working in compression, working in tension, because they kinked over the edge and held it back. In fact, I think I've got a picture saying without the railway lines, the thrust in the pier would be way outside, but you need about 10 tonnes a metre width of tension to hold that, and getting 10 tonnes a metre width is just no problem out of 4 railway lines in an 8 metre width. So it stayed there, stretched a bit. There was a 6-inch crack, sort of somewhere about, whoa, can you see that? Yeah, somewhere about there was a 6-inch crack. What did they do? They cleared up the rubbish on the floor, they built the trestle, put a prop in, pushed the piers back, put some beams across, got the trains running, rebuilt the pier, rebuilt the arches. You still go across the same bridge. Serious engineering. The sort of thing people say isn't possible. In war, things are more possible. So here's a lovely picture of the work starting up at railway level, and again, since there are fewer people over there, I'll go and point at this one. The important things that we notice is that it's hollow, and it was designed for the railway to sit on these walls. Well above the walls, but on the walls. And that modifies the behaviour. Yeah? If you haven't got fill in here, then the load doesn't distribute through the fill. It's going to sit on those walls, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's going to sit on those walls. On the other hand, the walls are like stiff arches, so they behave much better than the arches until they start to cramp. But notice how the arch is stuck up to here, still hanging there. And the reason for that is that from this level down, it's solid. So the edge of these walls, there isn't enough bond to carry all that brickwork. It fell off. But up to here, it's stuck. And that's an important part of our evening's message. It's happened elsewhere. First World War in northern France. Great chunk of viaduct knocked out, but in the end it came to rest suspended on the railway tracks. And it also happened in the 1990s in Inverness, when a pier got washed out and the end of the viaduct stood for some time. So what could go wrong? It's obvious that my model is safe and everything's secure and we're fine. And then in 2001 I was asked to have a look at these little bridges in the south of Scotland, and they're going crunch. That's serious crunch, isn't it? That's not just a little bit damaged, that's kind of a mess. And they said, yeah, we've checked these out with Mexi, and Mexi says they should take 40 tonnes axles, and we're running 22 tonne axles, and the stone is crushing, and the bridge is falling apart, and what's going on here? And the answer is that the load doesn't, as the codes tell us, distribute through the fill and then land on the effective strip of arch, and I'll say this more than once. It lands straight on the arch, and then the thrust spreads out, and that changes the behaviour completely. So you get very local damage at the critical point in the arch, and much less damage elsewhere. But these bridges are different anyway. Because when they demolished one just down the track, we found that, although people have denied this, there's a wall there, isn't there? Yeah? It's really quite obvious. There's a wall there with fill each side of it. Open topped, and that's very common in railway bridges. It's not universal, but it's common. They put a wall on top of the arch underneath the rail, and then filled in between to put ballast in. So they had some thought about the value of those walls. Exactly what thought, we don't know, because they didn't tell us. Back in 2005, we were looking at the value of different modelling tools for modelling arches. And if we take the standard railway distribution model and process it through Archie, we get a capacity for different spans of bridge that comes down to here and then just takes off. And in fact, all the models, just about all the models, go upwards at this point. And the bridges are failing down here lower than any of those, and those are supposed to be ultimate loads. So there's something wrong somewhere. And what we think is wrong is that if you take the standard model, you get a distribution underneath the wheel, which gives you a nice smooth curve there and a long stretch of load thrust well off the centre line, and therefore lots of little cracks instead of one big one. And the bridge fails when the thrust gets to the edge here and it falls off. But if you look at a distribution model that says the live load thrust is concentrated on the load and spread out as it travels towards the abutment, for the same bridge you get a thrust pattern like this, where here it's curling down perfectly happily because there's plenty of space to spread. Here we've got a sudden peak in the thrust, and then you get a hinge in one place. All the rotation is in one place, and therefore it's doing now as the trains go past. And then you're going to get trouble because all the water falls out and the load gets more and more concentrated in the stone until the stone says, I just can't deal with this, and flakes up. And that's what would happen if you actually had an effective strip. The effective strip would bend and the rest of the arch would stay still. And as soon as you look at that picture, it's obviously not viable. It can't work. But you've got continuity through here. This piece is going to be held down by this piece is going to be held up by that. Where the load is, you're going to get a dip. Away from the load, you're not going to get a dip. And in fact, the people who devised the effective strip measured deflections and they found exactly that. They just didn't see that's what it meant. And then in 2006, I got involved with Frodsham Viaduct. This is a picture from 1910. This is a picture from 2006. It looks a bit strange. It looks as though there's something solid in here. If you look at this bit, you can see it's just a shadow. Right? So the sun is shining right through the arch and making it look as though there's something solid in here. But actually it's 85 spans, 85 9-metre spans, and in 2006, whether it is now, it was the heaviest loaded viaduct in Britain. It's just to the east of to the west of Scunthorpe, and all the iron ore and coal and limestone that went into the Scunthorpe ironworks went over it this way, and all the steel that came out went over it that way. So there were 20 trains a day in each direction, and every one of those trains had 70 odd 25-ton axles. And 25-ton axles are serious. So one of the things this tells us is that if we're going to get trouble with bridges, we're going to get them in railways, not in roads. It's in railways where you get these big, big axles, and we're really testing it. It's been filled up to here. That was done in 1919, I think, because in 1919 they were worried about this viaduct. filling a viaduct like that is seriously expensive. The embankment occupies lots of land that you don't own. When you build the railway from scratch, you put a bill through Parliament, and that gives you the right to purchase the land whether people want you to or not. When you come back and say, oh, I need a bit more, there's a bit more of an argument involved. So you've got to find the fill, you've got to get it there, but you've also got to buy the land to put it on. So there was something serious wrong that prompted them to do that. This is pieced together from 2 photographs because it's before the days of models. But you can see there's all sorts of things going on in these spandrel walls and lots of patchwork. And I didn't get to the bottom of it, but you can see there's damage here. You can see there's a horizontal crack here. There's sort of horizontal stuff going on here. The one place where there isn't an embankment because there's a road going through, they've underlined the arches and put struts across. Interesting issue, isn't it? So now we've got a bridge in which there's continuous concrete, relatively small sections, so when the sun shines in on it, it expands. I wonder where that goes. Challenging. But there are all sorts of bad things happening. Indeed. People tend to think, sorry about the noise, that arch bridges don't move, but they really do. Yeah? Impressed, are we? Let's kill the noise. And people patch the bricks that come out, but they don't stress them into place. And sure enough, everything works around them and the bricks start to fall out again. What this is before I run the video. So the arch is running around here. This is the second ring. There's a bit of a smear of mortar on here, and there's actually an under ring of concrete. But the argument is that the ring is separating because of the crack running right around here. And I said, I'm not convinced. I'm going to put one of my telltales on there. So these telltales magnify the movement, and they also tell you the direction. Let's run the video and see if you can tell me what the direction is. So there's about 0.5 millimetre of deflection producing that movement. Which direction is it moving? That way? Yep. So it's moving radially. If the rings are separated, they'd be moving like that. The movement is radial, so this lower brick is being pushed from somewhere. The only way you can open it like that is by pushing it from somewhere. And what's happened is that crack goes back through like that underneath the spandrel wall. And the body of the arch is deflecting and the edge is not deflecting. In fact, we saw that here. That there. Yeah? So the edge of the brick is moving up and down. And here's another horizontal crack, and another one, and this was quite funny, and I did take a clip of video of this, but I can't find it. Those 3 bricks waggle up and down as the trains go past. Because they're sort of hinging. They're hanging out far enough that they waggle. There was another road through which hadn't been fixed, and they were busy fixing that. And this is another thing about keeping your eyes open and looking what people are doing. So putting in the foundation for that portal through there, they dug down beside the pier and felt the need to pump it dry, and let's see if I can stop it there, can I? Yes. This is the foundation, exposed. And they're pumping water out, and there's sand flowing out from underneath it in the water. I rang my client and was told in no uncertain terms that I mustn't interfere with the contractor in any way. And then I was sent this video. How about this? Can you see what's happening? Let's blow it up a bit and see whether it's any clearer here. The stone skewback is moving and the pier isn't. Now, I understood that Mr. Newton had something to say about that, didn't he? That every action has an equal and opposite reaction. What? Look up from there. So here's the skewback that's moving backwards and forwards. There's the arch here. There are horizontal cracks there, there, and there. The arch is in a bit of a state, isn't it? More of a state than it might look. There's a fair bit of movement going on there. Not entirely happy. This crack is at the bottom of the parapet, so here's the string course at the bottom of the parapet. So we're here. There's nothing to hold that up, we think. And yet, you can actually see this joint opening and closing, and the telltales amplify it. Go around inside, underneath the skewback, and put a telltale 1.5 meters from the end, stuck to the bottom of the stone and stuck to the face of the brickwork. It's still going up and down that far in. And there's also a crack in the face of the arch, and that one also needs to be jumped, I think, which is busy opening and closing as the trains go past. I'd made friends with a guy from the National Physical Laboratory who took a series of photographs like this, and he processed them to measure deflections. And we've got horizontal and vertical. We'll look at the verticals first. So the vertical movement here is 0 from the initial frame. Here it's going 0.5 millimeter down, here it's going 0.5 millimeter up. Here it's 0 at this point, it's relatively low up there, but there's a whole millimetre of lateral deflection there. So there's something going on here that we really don't understand. And then in 2015, we got to do some measurement in Manchester, and the layout was like this. We'd got 5 across the width, measuring at the quarter point and mid-span, and we were measuring there and also at the top of the piers. Here's a trace for a passenger train going over the bridge, measuring just the vertical deflections. Quite an interesting pattern, and it throws out places where things are not really quite what you were expecting, so you can possibly reject some readings, and there are some dead ones altogether. But much more useful than an individual deflection, getting patterns like this. And notice how in places notionally equally loaded bogies produce different deflection effects, depending on where they are in the span and which order is which. So we get symmetry and asymmetry. We get some interesting distribution across the width, including a particularly large deflection at one point. And then we start to look at the horizontal movement. So under the pier, at the top of the pier, as the train comes from this direction, it goes away, first of all, and then settles down into going backwards and forwards as the load goes from pier span to span, which is sort of what we're expecting. So we're reasonably happy about that. And then at the end of the train, it goes backwards. When there's no load behind it, the load is only in front, it goes backwards. Vertical movement. Well, naturally the pier goes down as the load comes on, but it doesn't respond quite so frequently, quite so rapidly. So it goes down, it goes up and down a little bit, and then it comes back when the train's gone past. Longitudinal movement at the crown of the arch. As you might expect here, it's more or less symmetrical, backwards and forwards. Relatively limited, 0.5 millimetre, no, 0.3 of a millimetre each way. This is one that I hadn't thought about. Transverse movement. The arch is moving sideways. Well, of course it is. It's a long way off the ground. You're putting load on one side. It leans over. I'd never thought of it. One of the benefits of measurement, if you measure enough stuff, if you don't measure just what you think you want to know, Measure enough bits and pieces, look at the whole picture, let it tell you the story, the whole bridge leans over and leans back again as the train goes over it. Interesting stuff. And all this tells us that stiffness governs force flow. No matter what you like to think. And the trouble with masonry is it's so stiff that people forget that the different parts still have different stiffness. Now everybody knows that a column is much stiffer than a beam, but people forget that a wall is much stiffer than an arch, and it's the same thing. The wall doesn't want to move, the arch does want to move, bad things are going to happen at that connection. It governs force flow every time. Structures are systems of interconnected stiffness, and you can't escape it. The trouble is that unlike nice structural frames, you can't analyse it either. Because you don't know how thick the ring is, you don't really know how high the backing is inside, you don't know how thick the wall is, and you certainly don't know how stiff the various materials are. What you do know is the bricks you can see on the outside are the best they had. And everything behind that is going to be much less sound. It's going to be less strong and less stiff, and probably less well built. And that has been going on since pre-Roman times. The masons knew that what mattered was the skin. It did the work, but you needed the weight for the stability, so you throw rubble and mortar into the hole and try to make sure that it moves with the skin. The cathedrals are all like that. And after 1,000 years they're starting to burst, and people are having to grout them up and pin them and things like that. But the pier block, I've said that the brick sticks to it. Yeah, we had that picture which showed the brick stuck to the underside of that solid block of masonry over the pier. And that means when you take the centering out, the arch doesn't go and become a nice strong arch resisting thrust. This piece stays as a solid lump and doesn't drop. And the only bit that drops and might become an arch is the piece in the middle. But if the piece in the middle is 3 metres long and this thick, even the brickwork is actually capable of spanning that far as a beam. So it never becomes an arch. And if you put a load on the end of that cantilever, the balance of behaviour between the two sides is very different. Somewhere around here is a point that isn't moving. The bottom of the block is moving away from the load, this piece is moving down, this piece is moving up, the reaction moves this way, and that's the only structural change. This is a mini fourth bridge. It's a cantilever. But that's okay, because trains have loads all the way along them. Well, they did until 1990. And then in 1990 they started scrapping the 2-axle vehicles that were carrying bulk freight and replacing them with 4-axle bogie wagons. Now the 2-axle wagons are 4 metres long within the wagon, and then 3 metres over the coupling, and then 4, and then 3, and then 4, and then 3. And that's a relatively modest space compared with a typical 9-metre span viaduct with 1.5 metres of pier. So you've got something very close to a UDO. And suddenly we move those 2 axles closer together, in this sense, further apart in the wagon, and suddenly you've got 4 25-ton axles in one span, and nothing at all in the next one. Nothing. 100 tons here, 50 tons on the end of this cantilever, 50 tons on the end of this cantilever, and nothing on the next one. And then bad things happen. And the parapet and spandrel wall doesn't want to bend. It says, I ain't going to bend. And it cracks, and you get a horizontal crack. And this goes down, and this goes up, and the whole thing rides on top. And it looks as though you've got a bridge going on skyhooks, but actually what's happening is that. It's easy, isn't it? How could it possibly take me 20 years to work it out? And there's the statics. If this weighs about 120 tonnes, which it does, and you've got 50 tonnes perched on the end of there, the reaction moves 800 millimetres, which is fine provided your pier is more than 1800 millimetres thick. If it's less than 1800 millimetres thick, then you're looking for something to come from somewhere else. So here's some measurements. Up along the top here we've got a strip which represents the axles in a train running over this bit of arch. Top of the pier here. Here we've got a target which is measuring horizontal and vertical movement. Here we're just measuring vertical, and here we're just measuring vertical. So we'll see all that move. And this is these three, just the vertical deflection plotted in a correct spacing this way, so that as we run the video you can see how all the bits move. So as the train approaches the end of the seesaw just rocks in that direction. The middle point bounces up and down a bit because it's much less sensitive than the gauges at the end, and then it rocks the other way, and then the twin axle comes and it rocks that way, perhaps a little further. Notice that it's also going down because you're putting weight on the pier, so the pier is going down as well. And then it does actually bend a little bit with a load on each end, comes back straight again, tips the other way. Great fun, isn't it? And does that happen elsewhere? Can we solve it? Well, here is a little viaduct in Bath, which has been under-ringed. The ring has been doubled, the pier has been doubled, and yet when we look closely at it, we're still getting mud pumping out of a horizontal crack here and flowing down the face of the arch. Not a solution, because what we've done is increase the stiffness by 10%, and we need to increase the stiffness by 100%. 10% doesn't make any difference. And here's a big one which is really looking quite serious. So the top of the backing is here, and at this point you've got solid material, a wall which is very stiff, solid material that's very stiff, and an arch which is not so stiff. And at the point where those three meet, you're going to get trouble. First of all, the solid means that all the rotation is going to happen there. The wall is saying, I don't want to rotate at that point. The arch is saying, well, I can probably handle it, but in the end it breaks. And when it breaks, pieces fall out. And it really wouldn't be a good idea to be standing under that bridge when that piece fell out. I don't see any danger to the railway. Not for the foreseeable future. But there is serious danger to people walking underneath. And then moving Skewback. Where did that all go? Well, let's start with a little rubber model and say, if we have relieving arches, as they call them, what are they there to relieve? People say the weight. It takes about 2% of the weight of the viaduct out. Doesn't make any difference at all. It might make a little bit of difference to the amount of work you put in, but even then it's not an awful lot. What these do is let the light through. If you build an 80-span viaduct and you look at the valley from the side, it's a wall. It looks awful. If you put a hole through the piers, for quite a lot of that length you can see through, and even when you can't see through, the light gets through, and it looks more graceful. It's a piece of architecture, not a piece of engineering, but it's a worthwhile piece of architecture, except unfortunately the engineering doesn't work, because if you put a load from side to side, it rocks, as we might expect, but if you put a load in the middle, the top wants to do that, and the bottom wants to do that as well. And when that happens, you get a crack there and a crack there, and all the load is transferred to the inside skin. And if you look at viaducts that look like that, you'll find lots of patching here and here. Not so much down here, although I have photographs of one where this piece has been repatched about 15 times. And between the two edges in the middle, there's half a brick of angle. So quite a lot. So the reason that it's flying here is the skewback is holding all these bricks together, and it's literally just sitting on 2 points in the inside edge. And I defy anybody to analyse that. I really do. I defy anybody to produce an analysis that tells you how that's going to behave in the long term as the trains go past, but it's good fun. Back in 2001, I sketched this to show how I thought the crack here happened, because we knew there was a crack here. The same people have been patching cracks here, not saying anything about it. Just cover it up, just put another layer of brick on top and cover it up. And that's what a hinge looks like in masonry. And here's a viaduct which is splitting down the middle, doing the splits, and the sort of trouble we get. So, a few conclusions for where we've got to. The models we use at the moment aren't fit for purpose. Changing codes of practice which are clearly not fit for purpose is very hard work. The emotional commitment is colossal. Yeah? Because you're talking to people in their 60s who've been doing this all their lives. And if the code is wrong, it means all that work is wrong. But you have to call halt, don't you? This is engineering. People's lives depend on this. It isn't politics. People will actually die in the long term if this is wrong and we just close our minds to it. We have to think about it. The damage is cumulative. There's been a crazy assumption that the ultimate load is a surrogate for the serviceability load, that if we divide by 3 it'll be fine. No, not true. There is no real connection between the ultimate load and the serviceability load. You need to work on serviceability. We need new models. We need a new model for the distribution. We need a new model for interaction between the spans. We need a new model for peer behaviour. And until we've got one, most of what we do is wrong. The interventions we make on the bridges are based on false models. They aren't going to work. People say, it worked, the bridge didn't fall down. It wasn't going to fall down. It was damaged by attrition. It's not a test. Ring separation is often wrongly diagnosed. So that arch where we saw that the movement was such that it couldn't be ring separation, nevertheless they spent £25,000 stitching the rings together. We know that the rings were still together because we checked it. But no, we know what's going on here. The rings are separated, stitch the rings together. And that means putting reinforcement into an arch that doesn't need it. And the reason these arches work so well and last so long is they've got no reinforcement in them. So we've made a modification which is doing damage and it's not doing any good. When you get a crack through the arch the other way, the standard routine is to stitch it. Drill a hole here, put a 1-inch bar in. It's fine, isn't it? No, it doesn't work. And if you think about it, it can't work. Because the stiffness of a lump of brickwork this thick is colossal. It's going to move. If it wants to move, it's going to move. That 1-inch bar isn't going to stop it. The 1-inch bar may be strong enough, but it will bend. And as it bends, it will crowbar the brickwork apart or destroy it. A more interesting one to which I haven't got an answer by any means, a little skew bridge, also in Manchester. The one on the right was lined with plastic. This one's different. The rest of the spans are all 40-foot span. What's that in modern money? 12.5 metres. 40-foot span, 8-foot rise, I think. Yeah, I think they were 8-foot rise. This one is 45 feet span and still 8-foot rise, just to add to the fun. You can see here in the plastic lining, you can see that it skews. Can you measure the deflections there? Well, it's a bit difficult with that plastic there because we don't know what plastic's doing. And then I looked more closely and realised that there are screws in the plastic holding it up. And they must be screwed to something. And I was fairly confident they were screwed to battens that were just screwed direct to the brick. So we can get some sort of approximation by putting our deflection gauges on those screws. But there's a sort of warning that this bridge is behaving in slightly difficult fashion. There are bits of stonework breaking off at the corners. And we decided to measure deflection in rather more places. We had 30 gauges, so we put 30 gauges in. We put them at 1 metre centre across the width, so we put 5 of them rather than 3 through the span. And then when we measured a few trains there, we moved some of them across, so we picked up the other half. And then we found 2 identical trains and measured the deflections. The deflection patterns don't look too silly. You get a little bit of a hump as the train approaches. It goes down under the first bogie. You can see the separation of 2 bogies, but you can't see the separation between the 2 axles in a bogie. That's 3 metres placed 2 metres, and 3 metres is enough to make that little bit. And there's a sort of differential between one side and the other depending on where the load is. But life gets more interesting if you plot those deflections in a pattern that you can see. And you'll be able to see that what we've got here is 2 lots of records stitched together, so there's an overlap in the middle. But they work fairly well. These are 2 separate videos, but they start at more or less the same time, and if I click there and there, they'll start more or less together. And you'll see this one, to start with, rises as the train approaches, and then goes down under the train. And you can see the train working its way across. You can see there's a huge peak in the deflections here. And actually the gauges still weren't close enough, as we'll see shortly. And we also measured the horizontal movement. And Hamish, my son, who was doing this work, produced these graphs, and I said, there's something there, but it's not telling me anything. Can you combine the longitudinal and the transverse and just produce a snake picture? And let's see what happens. And there we go. Tell me what's happening. Span in this direction, quarter point, midway, quarter point. This is the width of the bridge. What's funny about those plots? This is the direction that's really interesting. This side is moving sideways twice as far as this side. That bridge is getting wider as the train goes by. At which point I say, look guys, this is serious. Just take one minute, will you? Let's have a look. Because we knew there'd been 6 longitudinal cracks in 2006 before they put the lining up, but they were only less than a millimetre wide, so it wasn't a worry, was it? I'm going to skip over those because we're running out of time. This is what it looked like after it had been taken down and after it had been stitched. But if we look at, before they started stitching it, it's not surprising it was trouble, is it? So that's in just over 10 years from a 1mm crack to that sort of damage. So the reason for that big step was that the outside edge was moving independently of the inside edge, and you'd actually got something like that going on at the crack. And here you can see there's a 50mm step now in the bridge, as well as big gaps. And there are things in here which I refer to as chopstones, where the bridge is shearing in this direction, and if you get something bridging across the gap like that, then it acts as a jack, and it produces much more movement this way than this way. And that's why the bridge is doing this as the thing goes past. And here's what happens if you take, I think there are 3 points there, and extend them and extend that, and there's your 1.5mm differential across that track with the movement. But that's fine because we know how to deal with this. We're just going to stitch it because that's what the book says. Put a 1 inch bar here and a 1 inch bar there every ½ metre through the span. And here is your stitched bridge. and there's still a 1.5mm differential deflection. So there's 3 Saturday night possessions, people working all through Saturday night, probably 20 people there, drilling those holes, stitching that in. How much did that cost? Doesn't work. We have a new way of looking with our 3D models, and actually I only thought of this last night. We can put a horizontal plane through and it produces a contour where it cuts the bridge. And isn't that interesting? Yeah? So where the contours are closer together, the bridge is lower. So it's low here. For some reason it's higher in the middle here. And then it drops back at that point, and then there's another drop at the edge. All sorts of interesting stuff to pull out. I've never seen anything like it. I have now started looking at skew railway bridges. There were actually 8 longitudinal cracks, all parallel to the edge. And I've seen at least 4 more with similar damage. It only happens when there's relatively little fill, or seems to, or maybe I should say it only happens yet if there's relatively little fill, but I have no idea what causes it yet. We need to observe it, we need to look at them, we need to find more of them and look at the damage and compare the differences between the bridges. We need to measure it and we need to think about it. So, the essence of what I wanted to say is just remember the code may be wrong and that some things can't be analysed. All you can do is think about it. And you have to think about it and you have to be able to defend your thinking. But you also have to accept the fact that your thinking may be wrong and you may have to revise it. Richard Feynman, who won a Nobel Prize for Physics, was heard to say, "When the facts change, I change my opinions." And it's something that engineers are really not good enough at. When the facts change your opinions. The facts haven't actually changed, it's just your view of the facts have changed. But we have a duty of care to the public, and that transcends our duty of care to either the client or the boss, in my view. You can't risk people's lives, whatever the boss says, whatever the client says. So as you look around, keep your eyes open, keep your mind open. That's the hard bit. Look and think about what you're seeing. Remember that seeing is interpreting. You don't see the truth. What you see is what your brain is expecting to see, unless you really put your mind to not jumping to conclusions. And if the facts change your mind. And can I recommend a practice that I have, which is to, when you're walking about, take photographs with your phone and tweet them, and make it your business at least once a day to see something strange, structural, and pick it up and tweet it. Because the more you do it, the more you will see, and it's kind of important.
Thanks, Bill. It was fantastic. Any comments on the floor?
The change in the railway going.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that a bit? When did it happen?
Sometime in the 1990s, but I'm not sure when. So in the UK, coal, for example, was shifted in 50-ton wagons with 225-ton axles. The axles were 4 metres apart on the wagon, and then typically it's 3 metres between adjacent axles over the coupling. So 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4, and it's sort of distributed. Yeah? You've always got another couple of those in the span, basically. And then the HTA vehicles came in, and they sound wonderful. You know, the old vehicles got clang, they've got metal springs and no dampers and all the rest of it. The new vehicles have air springs, and they go swoosh, swoosh, and you think that must be much better for the bridge. It sounds so sweet. Now we're going to do this. Put all that load there. And it's sort of the law of unintended consequences, isn't it? But it's going to be very hard to backpedal. Though to me, it's going to be touch and go whether it's cheaper to throw away all those vehicles and go back to 2-axle one, or repair the viaducts.
Wouldn't actually was the question I had for you, Bill, was that, you know, the new model, as you say, has
Yeah.
the rigid block, which is translated
Yeah.
to the shortened arch,
Mm.
they're being exacerbated by the new loading. Well, what then is the remediation efforts that the owner should be looking at?
We're working on it. I think I have a solution, but I'm spent many, many unpaid months thinking about this, and I'm not just going to give away the solution without some return, if you don't mind. Repairing once the damage has begun is really very difficult. Yeah? You move into a completely different array of problems. But one thing that is clearly necessary is to find a way of generating some thrust in the arch for the arch to work as thrust, and some kind of abutment for it to respond to. Yeah? If the top of the pier isn't producing an abutment, then you've got to find a way of doing it. But you've also got to put some thrust into the arch. But it also says interesting things about thermal effects in viaducts. If they have never actually formed an arch, then it isn't in compression to start with, and when it gets hotter, it gets a bit of compression but not much. Whereas if it was an arch to start with, then when it expanded, you would get increasing compression. And if you've got like a kilometre long viaduct and the whole thing heats up, the chances are one point is going to give and all the movement will concentrate there. And certainly from, I think in the 1920s, poof, suddenly happened in Stockport viaduct. And nobody's ever got to the bottom of it. They fixed it and it's sort of fine, but nobody really knows what caused it. And I think it may be something like this, that the temperature just built up over the whole thing until everything closed up and then it just concentrated in one span and went pop. So one thing you clearly can't do is set to and generate thrust in the whole length of the bridge. But on the other hand, if you were to say take 3 or 4 spans and pre-stress them together to make them work as a unit, then the span at the end suddenly has even less compression, and it's interesting. Yeah? But as I say, you have to think about it first. You can't just throw it at the computer and say, tell me what happens. You have to actually sit and think and walk around and think and sleep and think and live the whole thing and feel, try to feel what the bridge is feeling to make sense of it. And it's very different from the structural engineering you're taught in university. And to be fair, very different from what most people are faced with. But it has, I think, lessons that spread elsewhere, that we're just too hooked into the idea that there are these rules and they're right and there's this program and it produces the right answer, and then something goes wrong, and why? Well, when things go wrong, then you need to think again. Sorry. Cool.
Question?
So, can I just say, actually I met Bill back in, was it May, in London, and suggested coming over. Certainly what we've seen this evening has been very worthwhile. It's something that I think in the education system is something that we're going to have a serious look at, because what's happening in a lot of engineering courses is people are learning what very often referred to as black box technology. They're putting in all this information, making certain assumptions, they're getting a result, and that result, in their eyes, is 100% correct, having maybe total or some disregard for the assumptions. And I go back to Professor John DeCourcy here in UCD many years ago, and he used to always remind us that you need to be absolutely certain that you're making the exact same assumptions that the structure is making.
Well, the structure doesn't make assumptions.
Correct, yeah.
The structure gets it right.
And so it's important that we are aware that the black box that you're putting the information into is behaving in the exact same way.
And the most frightening assumptions are the ones that are made for you, not the ones that you make, that you know you make. The ones that are really deep trouble are the ones that are implied, that you never really see. And yeah, I can't think of a way of expressing that any better at the moment, but I think you probably understand what I mean, that there are assumptions built into the black box that you're unaware of at some level, and those are the most difficult ones. But it's really, in my view, it's really useful, if you can possibly do it, just to think about relative stiffnesses. How stiff is this? How stiff is that? Is this stiffer than that? Is it an order of magnitude stiffer? Is it 2 orders of magnitude stiffer? Or is it just 50% stiffer? If it's 50% stiffer, it's maybe not going to cause much trouble. If it's two orders of magnitude stiffer, then you might get some serious trouble.
Just doing the railway viaducts with the vertical walls,
Mm-hmm.
and the walls into the arch. If you take away those, if anybody ever taken away those walls and replaced them with two, make an only use.
They've done something more or less equivalent, which is to fill in between them with concrete.
Oh, yeah.
But usually that follows damage that's already started. And it doesn't backtrack the damage. And one thing is that if you put concrete in it takes a week at best to generate anything resembling strength. If you close the railway for 2 days, fill it with concrete and start running the trains, it's still a loop. And if the body of the viaduct is rotting, and the side is saying no, either it does that and breaks the arch off, or it locks together and rots and breaks the wall off. And sometimes it seems to do both. And I suspect that's a function of the stiffness as being just at that sort of tipping point where you don't know which is going to fail first, but one of them goes, and as soon as it's gone, the next level will go.
What was your question?
So,
Thank you very much for the presentation, very interesting. Question I have is obvious how useful this 3D modeling would be for maintenance and assessment of the arches. And I, at the beginning of my career, I did some assessment of bridges in Dublin and in Wicklow, about 300 bridges. And my boss, the company I worked for, I remember we were talking, it was 2014, so it just started coming out of the crisis. And he was saying, during the good times, they were pricing around 2,000 per bridge. And when I started, we did 200 per bridge. So, anyway, it was just numbers for me. I look at it now, and technology is amazing. And the question I had, in your opinion, how feasible is it that companies like IStructE or local councils would take something like that on board? People say
3D modelling.
well, I know it's probably for the major bridges, but even say in Wicklow was in research in one of the bridges, 8% were amazing as bridges.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it seems that
Can I first of all go back to 1994, 95, when I was sort of running out of places to go in Dundee, and before I got a job in Exeter, which turned out to be a mistake anyway, and people were saying to me, why don't you go out and settle in business and do bridge assessments? And I said, people are doing bridge assessments for £300. Yeah? And let's be right about that. And I think, we're engineers, okay? So let's just be right about £300 for a bridge assessment. The engineer who makes that bid knows that it can't be done. And the person who accepts the bid knows it can't be done. And they're both engineers, and they're both lying. And that is a very serious problem in engineering practice. Very serious. Better not to do it than to do it inadequately or wrong or, For £200, you can't slow down in the car as you drive past it, let alone look at it properly, can you? Hey? £200? You drive past the bridge and don't even slow down, you just have a quick look at it as you go past. It isn't right. The 3D modelling is a bigger issue. Because if people say, well, we can build a finite element model of this bridge now. Well, maybe you can, But let's just remember that the best bricks are on the outside, and the ones on the inside aren't as good, but we don't know how much less good they are. We don't know how stiff they are. We don't know how many there are. We don't know how thick the wall is. We don't know how stiff that is. We don't know how stiff the fill is. So these are all assumptions that go into the model. So you're only going to get any sort of help out of your model if you do a parameter study on each one of those. So if we say we've got 5 parameters and we want to go at least 20% up and down on each of them, so we're going to do 3 variations on each of 5 parameters, I've lost count. It's a lot, isn't it? Yeah? It's not 15, it's a good deal more than that. Analyses to map the field. And if your analysis takes, as is not unusual, 2 to 3 days to run on the computer, then you've got big problems. You can't do it. We've got some work going on at the moment on this viaduct problem at Imperial College, where they're modelling theoretical bridges and looking at the behaviour as a general thing. For that purpose, it's wonderful. It's vastly cheaper than building a bridge and testing it, is to build a model and test that. And then we can play a bit with the parameters and see how they go as well. And we can go and measure some bridges and see what the deflections look like and see whether the patterns more or less correspond or don't. It's no good saying it's a millimetre here and the model says it should be 0.1 or it should be 5. We're not going to get that sort of correlation. Is the pattern similar? Then we can get something useful from it. But yeah, the underpriced engineering is a real worry. And bridge assessments is a place where it's... Though I have to say, in the UK, I think that bridge assessments are now very generously priced, and people are still doing the £200 job. And it's not being properly supervised because Network Rail don't have the staff to do it. So people are getting paid £6,000 to assess a bridge and doing well under £1,000 worth of work. Now they may be spending more money on it than £1,000, but they're doing well under £1,000 worth of work. And that's not good either, because that means the client is really being taken to the cleaners. And when they have some serious stuff to do, then where are they going to go?
Just in terms of the photogrammetry there, just thinking about that is that it's a common garden and cameras are used to capture the data, but...
The cameras are common garden, the computer and the software costs, I think we're paying £700 a month rental for the software, which is non-trivial for a start. The computer it's running on, we started off with 32 gigabytes of memory. We upped that to 96, and a month ago we upped it to 128. It's got a terabyte of SSD as a cache, right? So just for the working thing, and moving from half to a full terabyte, half the time it took to build a model. Moving from 96 to 128 gigabytes of memory, half the time it took to build a model. So we're now building very, very high detail models, typically with 25 to 30,000 photographs, and we're looking at 3 to 5 days of computing time. But the computing time costs nothing. You know, it's only using 100 watts, and the computers these days, I mean, it sounds colossal, but actually we're talking about less than 10,000 for a computer that's going to, a lot less than 10,000 for a computer that's going to do that. And the outcome is just completely transformational. If you compare it with what you get from a laser point cloud, which is often not properly registered, so you get clouds from different places that don't meet, the result is completely in a different order altogether. And I think that it's a thing to do. And it's a thing to do at the lower scale as well. So I was talking earlier at Irish Rail about the bridge that we lifted, and when they were on site they found an enormous crack in the back of the abutment, and they said, Bill, we need you on site to look at this. I said, I can't come for 3 days. And the guy who rang me, I said, look, you've got an iPhone, will you take 40 or 50 photographs like this? And he took the photographs, he emailed them from his phone to Hamish, who put them into the software, built a 3D model, sent it to me, and I was able to turn around and look at it. It's completely, and that took about 2 hours. And it completely transforms the process. It means that I'm, to all intents and purposes, there. I can then talk to the guy on site and say, it looks like this, is that real? It doesn't look like that. It looks as though it tapers out to nothing there. Does it taper out to nothing there? It looks as though these bricks are all laid out as soldiers, are they? Yes, they are. Yeah, so there's all sorts of levels at which it can be used. And in the end, it's going to be completely transformational. But getting the photographs in, getting them assembled, getting the model built, it's a 3-stage process, no, a 4-stage process. So first of all, the computer works out where the camera was, then it produces basically a point cloud, just like a laser, and then the point cloud has to be rationalized to produce triangles, and then it puts photograph back on the triangles. And you can have different levels of numbers of triangles, depending on what level of detail you want. And that also means that by using different levels of triangles, you can get general shapes or detail. And if you want to look at general shapes, it's often better to have a coarser model and look at how the general shape works. But we think that there's so much learning involved and software expense involved that in the long term, the right thing is going to be for there to be a service to build the models, but the people on the job take the photographs. And that may involve a little bit of training, it may involve some practice, but if you've got people on site anyway for a couple of days, then they can take some photographs and send them in, and you can ring back and say, well, actually you need some more photographs here. And that phase that tells you how many whether you've got enough photographs can be done typically in 3 or 4 hours. So it is possible overnight to tell people, no, that you've got a hole here where you haven't got enough pictures. Go back and take some more. Sorry, we're running well on. Just walk away when it's time. Yeah.
Any final questions from the floor? I'm going to call our former Secretary Simon to do a vote. Thanks.
Bill, thank you very much for that. It was a really interesting talk, sort of covering obviously the theoretical and analytical aspects of it, and also the practical elements of it, with so many takeaways, I think, for everyone here. I think I'd summarise it in one respect, maybe having greater regard for the stiffness of the materials in the